The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hummed their indifferent tune as Yuki. Tanaka lay in bed 713, clutching a photograph of her granddaughter with trembling hands. At 78 years old, she had built an empire that spanned 3 continents, commanded boardrooms in Tokyo, London, and New York, and her signature could move millions with a single stroke. But here, in this sterile room where the antiseptic smell mixed with her rising panic, none of that mattered. She was alone, trapped inside a body that had betrayed her and a language barrier that had become an impenetrable wall. The stroke had stolen her English, leaving her only with the Japanese words of her childhood, and as tears rolled down her weathered cheeks, she realized that all her wealth couldn't buy her the one thing she desperately needed: someone who could simply understand her. The morning shift nurses had tried their best. Jennifer brought extra pillows, mistaking Yuki's distressed gestures for physical discomfort. Marcus adjusted the television to different channels, hoping to find something that would calm her. Dr. Patterson spoke slowly and loudly, as if volume could somehow bridge the linguistic divide. But Yuki's anguish only deepened. She needed to tell them about her medication allergies, about the pain radiating down her left side, about her granddaughter in Osaka who needed to be contacted. The words swirled in her mind, perfect and precise in Japanese, but they dissolved into frustrated silence against the blank, apologetic faces surrounding her. "We've tried the translation app, but she's too agitated to use it," Jennifer whispered to Marcus at the nurse's station. "And her assistant who speaks English is stuck in Tokyo waiting for a visa. Won't be here for at least 3 days. What about that translation service the hospital contracts with? Backed up for hours. We've got her on the waiting list. But in the meantime," Jennifer trailed off, glancing back at room 713 where they could hear Yuki's muffled sobs. Nobody noticed Tommy Rodriguez pushing his cleaning cart down the corridor. At 62, Tommy had been mopping floors and emptying trash bins at St. Mary's for 17 years. He wore the same navy blue uniform every day, arrived before dawn and left after dusk. Nurses smiled at him politely but rarely remembered his name. Doctors looked through him as if he were part of the furniture. To most people at St. Mary's, Tommy was invisible, just another pair of hands that kept the hospital running, while the important work happened around him. But Tommy had a story that nobody knew. 40 years ago, he had been a young Marine stationed in Okinawa, where he'd fallen deeply in love with a Japanese woman named Akiko. For 2 years, he'd immersed himself in her language and culture, planning a future that seemed inevitable. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Akiko's family needed her back in Tokyo, and Tommy's military service pulled him back to the States. They'd promised to find their way back to each other. But promises are fragile things across such vast distances. Eventually, the letters stopped coming, and Tommy returned to Los Angeles, carrying his broken heart and an unexpected gift: fluent Japanese that he'd had no reason to speak for decades. As Tommy approached room 713 with his mop and bucket, he heard something that stopped him mid-step. Through the partially open door came words he hadn't heard in 40 years, spoken in the desperate tone of someone drowning. "Tasukete kudasai. Dereka watashi no koto o wakatte kudasai. Help me, please. Someone understand me." His hands moved before his mind could catch up, parking the cart and pushing open the door. Yuki looked up, her eyes red and swollen, expecting another kind stranger who couldn't help her. But then Tommy spoke, his Japanese rusty but unmistakable. "Daijoubu desu ka? Nanika o tetsudai dekimasu ka? Are you okay? Can I help you?" The photograph slipped from Yuki's fingers. For a moment, she could only stare at this janitor in his worn uniform, this unexpected angel who had appeared with the words she'd been praying to hear. Then everything poured out of her, a torrent of Japanese that Tommy struggled at first to follow. But gradually, the old language came back to him, like muscle memory returning to an athlete after years away. "The medication," he translated urgently to Jennifer, who had rushed in when she heard the commotion. "She's allergic to penicillin, but it's on her IV, and she's having severe pain in her left leg. Not just discomfort. She thinks there might be a blood clot." Jennifer's face went pale. She immediately called Dr. Patterson, who ordered the IV stopped and arranged for an emergency ultrasound. They found the clot within 20 minutes. "Another hour," Dr. Patterson later said, and they would have been looking at a very different outcome, possibly fatal. But Tommy didn't leave after the emergency passed. He pulled up a chair next to Yuki's bed, and for the first time in decades, he spoke the language that still held pieces of his heart. Yuki told him about her granddaughter, Hana, who was getting married next month. About the cherry blossom tree she'd planted at her home in Kyoto the day her husband died. About how frightened she'd been, lying in that bed, feeling herself disappear behind a wall of incomprehension. Tommy told her about Akiko, the words coming easier than they had in years. About the letters he'd kept in a box in his closet. About how he'd chosen to stay in Los Angeles, working humble jobs, because somehow leaving felt like abandoning the last connection to that chapter of his life. "You still love her," Yuki said in Japanese, and it wasn't a question. "I suppose I do," Tommy replied. "Some people mark your soul. They never really leave." Over the next 3 days, until Yuki's assistant arrived from Tokyo, Tommy spent every break at her bedside. He translated for doctors and nurses, explained American hospital procedures, and helped Yuki video call her granddaughter. The hospital staff watched in amazement as their invisible janitor revealed hidden depths, bridging not just a language gap but a human one. On his final visit before Yuki's assistant arrived, she took his hand. "Tommy-san," she said, "I have spent my life believing that power comes from what you build, what you own, what you control. But you've taught me that real power is simpler than that. It's being present for another human being when they need you most. It's the kindness of speaking someone's language, literally and figuratively." She pressed something into his palm. It was a business card with a handwritten note in Japanese. "My company has an office in Tokyo. If you ever want to go back, to find her, I can help. Consider it a debt of gratitude that I can never truly repay." Tommy looked at the card for a long moment, then at Yuki's hopeful face. For 40 years, he'd been invisible, unnoticed, unremarkable. But in 3 days, he'd been reminded that everyone carries hidden continents inside them, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. 6 months later, Jennifer at the nurse's station received a postcard from Tokyo. It showed cherry blossoms in full bloom and bore a simple message in English: "Found her. Thank you for everything, Tommy." Tucked inside was a photograph of Tommy and an elegant older woman, both smiling like teenagers, standing under a canopy of pink blossoms. Nobody at St. Mary's had understood the Japanese billionaire. But the janitor had spoken her language, and in doing so, he'd rediscovered his own. Sometimes the most profound connections happen between the most unlikely people, and sometimes being seen, truly seen, is worth more than all the wealth in the world.